The Graveyard Secret. In the fading twilight of Dustwood Valley, where the desert wind carries more secrets than sand, a lone figure walked through the iron gates of the town cemetery. Cowman, a weathered rancher in his mid-40s, clutched a bundle of wildflowers against his chest, the same purple blooms his mother had loved when she was alive. His boots crunched softly on the gravel path as he made his way toward the familiar headstones that marked his parents' final resting place. The cemetery was supposed to be empty at this hour. Most folks in Dustwood avoided the graveyard after sunset, claiming the desert spirits grew restless when darkness fell. But Cowman had never been one to believe in such tales. He preferred the solitude that came with the evening hours, when he could speak to his parents without curious eyes, watching from behind curtained windows. As he approached the weathered granite markers, something caught his attention. A small shadow huddled near a freshly dug grave about 20 yards away. Cowman squinted through the dim light, his hand instinctively moving to the worn handle of his Colt revolver. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized the shadow wasn't a threat. It was a child. The boy couldn't have been more than 12 years old, thin as a rail, and shivering despite the warm desert evening. His clothes were little more than rags, torn and stained with dirt and what looked like dried tears. He sat with his back against a simple wooden cross, the kind the town used for paupers and outcasts, those who died without enough money for a proper headstone. Cowman recognized the boy immediately. Everyone in Dustwood knew the tragic story of young Timothy Fletcher, though most preferred to pretend they didn't. The child was the son of Black Jack Fletcher, the notorious outlaw who had terrorized the territory for years before meeting his end just 3 days ago. The whole town had watched as Sheriff Morrison put 2 bullets in Black Jack's chest during what should have been a simple train robbery gone wrong. But there was more to the Fletcher family tragedy than most people knew, and Cowman could see the weight of it in the boy's hollow eyes. Timothy's mother, Sarah, and his younger sister, Emma, had vanished from town nearly 2 weeks ago. The official story was that they had run off in shame, unable to bear the disgrace of being associated with Black Jack's crimes. But Cowman had heard the whispers, the fragments of truth that people shared in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. The boy looked up as Cowman approached, his eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. "Please, mister," Timothy whispered, his voice barely audible above the evening wind. "I ain't causing no trouble. I just wanted to say goodbye to my pa." Cowman felt something twist in his chest, a familiar ache that reminded him of his own lonely childhood after his parents had died in a wagon accident 25 years ago. He had been older than Timothy when tragedy struck, but he remembered the crushing weight of being truly alone in the world. "When's the last time you ate, son?" Cowman asked, kneeling down to the boy's level. He could see the sharp angles of Timothy's cheekbones, the way his clothes hung loose on his small frame. Timothy's stomach answered before he could speak, growling loudly in the quiet cemetery. The boy's face flushed with embarrassment. I found some berries yesterday, and Mrs. Henderson threw out some bread that was only a little moldy." The revelation hit Cowman like a physical blow. This child had been surviving on scraps and garbage, while the entire town turned their backs on him. He understood their fear. Black Jack Fletcher had been a dangerous man, and people worried that violence might run in the family. But Timothy was just a boy, and he was starving. "Come on," Cowman said, standing and extending his hand. "You're coming home with me tonight. We'll get some proper food in you." Timothy's eyes filled with tears, but he hesitated. "You don't understand, mister. Everyone in town, they hate me. They think I'm going to turn out like my pa. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're wrong," Cowman replied firmly. "A man's character isn't determined by his father's sins. It's determined by his own choices. And right now I'm choosing to help you, and you're choosing to accept that help. That's a good start." As they walked through the cemetery gates together, Cowman noticed several curtains twitching in the windows of nearby houses. By morning, the whole town would know that the lonely rancher had taken in Black Jack Fletcher's boy. Some would call him foolish, others might call him dangerous, but Cowman had learned long ago that doing the right thing rarely came with popular approval. The ride to Cowman's ranch took 30 minutes through the desert scrubland. Timothy sat quietly beside him on the wagon bench, occasionally glancing up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The boy seemed afraid to speak, as if he expected this kindness to be snatched away at any moment. Cowman's ranch was modest but well-maintained, a small wooden house with a wraparound porch, a barn for his horses, and enough land to graze a small herd of cattle. It wasn't much, but it was honest work, and it had given him a peaceful life away from the complications of town politics and social expectations. Inside the house, Cowman lit the oil lamps and began preparing a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and salt pork. Timothy sat at the kitchen table, his eyes wide as he watched the food being prepared. When Cowman finally placed the plate in front of him, the boy ate with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't seen a proper meal in days. "Slow down there, son," Cowman said gently. "Food's not going anywhere. There's plenty more where that came from." As Timothy's immediate hunger was satisfied, Cowman poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from the boy. "Now then," he said, "why don't you tell me what really happened to your family? And don't give me that story about your mother and sister running off. I've been around long enough to know when folks are hiding something." Timothy's fork paused halfway to his mouth. For a moment, Cowman thought the boy might refuse to answer. But then the dam broke, and the words came pouring out like water through a cracked levee. "They didn't run off," Timothy whispered, his voice shaking. "They were sold. My pa, he owed money to some bad men, and when he couldn't pay, they took Ma and Emma as payment. Said they'd work off the debt in one of them fancy houses in Silver Creek." Cowman's blood ran cold. Silver Creek was a mining town 50 miles north, known for its saloons, gambling halls, and brothels. It was no place for a decent woman, let alone a young girl. "Who were these men?" Cowman asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Pa never told me their names," Timothy continued, "but I heard him talking to someone the night before the train robbery. He was drunk, and he was crying, which I ain't never seen him do before. He kept saying he was sorry, that he never meant for it to go this far, and he mentioned the mayor's name. Said Mayor Blackwood had promised him one last job that would pay enough to buy Ma and Emma back." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place in Cowman's mind, forming a picture so ugly and corrupt that it made his stomach turn. Mayor Blackwood was one of the wealthiest men in the territory, with interests in mining, cattle, and banking. He was also known for his business relationships with some of the more unsavory characters who operated in the gray areas between law and lawlessness. "Timothy," Cowman said carefully, "are you telling me that Mayor Blackwood set up that train robbery? That he sent your father to steal money from his own bank?" The boy nodded miserably. "Pa said the mayor knew exactly how much money would be on that train because he was the one who ordered it. Said it was all insured anyway, so nobody would really lose nothing except the insurance company. But something went wrong. Pa was supposed to get away clean, but Sheriff Morrison was waiting for him. It was like someone told the sheriff exactly where to be." Cowman leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If Timothy's story was true, then Mayor Blackwood had orchestrated the entire tragedy. He had arranged for Sarah and Emma Fletcher to be sold into prostitution, then sent Blackjack on a suicide mission to rob the very train that carried Blackwood's own money. When the robbery went wrong and Blackjack was killed, Blackwood would collect the insurance money while eliminating the one man who could expose his involvement in the human trafficking operation. It was a plan so coldly calculated that it took Cowman's breath away. And now Timothy was the only person alive who knew the truth, which made him incredibly dangerous to a man like Mayor Blackwood. "Son," Cowman said quietly, "you can't ever repeat what you just told me to anyone else in town. Do you understand? There are people who would hurt you to keep this secret buried." Timothy nodded solemnly. "I know, sir. That's why I've been hiding in the cemetery. I didn't know where else to go." As the evening wore on, Cowman prepared a bed for Timothy in the small spare room that had once belonged to his younger brother. The boy fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted by days of fear and hunger. But Cowman sat awake long into the night, staring out at the desert and wrestling with the weight of what he had learned. He thought about his own parents, buried in that cemetery where he had found Timothy. They had been simple, honest people who believed in doing right by their neighbors. They had taught him that a man's worth wasn't measured by his wealth or his position in society, but by his willingness to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Tomorrow he would begin the dangerous work of seeking justice for the Fletcher family. He would find a way to rescue Sarah and Emma from whatever hell they had been sold into. And somehow, he would expose Mayor Blackwood's crimes without getting himself and Timothy killed in the process. As the first light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, Cowman made a silent promise to the sleeping boy in the next room. Timothy Fletcher would not face this world alone. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, Cowman would see this family reunited and their tormentors brought to justice. The graveyard had given up its secret. Now it was time to act on it. Hi, how are you? I'm interrupting quickly just to ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help a lot. Thank you, and I hope you like the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cowman's ranch as he prepared for the most dangerous day of his life. Timothy sat at the kitchen table, picking at a breakfast of eggs and bacon, while Cowman cleaned his rifle with methodical precision. The boy had slept fitfully, crying out in his dreams for his mother and sister. "I've been thinking about what you told me last night," Cowman said, not looking up from his weapon. "If we're going to help your family, we need proof of what Mayor Blackwood did. And we need allies. People in town who aren't afraid to stand up to him." Timothy's fork clattered against his plate. "There ain't nobody like that in Dustwood, mister. The mayor owns half the businesses in town and the other half owe him money. Even Sheriff Morrison does what he's told." "Maybe," Cowman replied, "but there's always someone who's tired of being pushed around. We just have to find them." Their first stop was the telegraph office, where Cowman sent a carefully worded message to his old friend Marcus Webb, a federal marshal based in the territorial capital. The message was simple. "Need help with local corruption. Come quickly. CM." If anyone could help them navigate the legal complexities of taking down a corrupt mayor, it would be Marcus. Next, they visited the town's newspaper office, where editor Harold Finch was setting type for the weekly edition. Finch was a thin, nervous man who had always struck Cowman as someone with more integrity than courage, but perhaps the right motivation could change that. "Mr. Finch," Cowman said, closing the office door behind them, "I have a story for you. The biggest story this town has ever seen." Finch looked up from his printing press, his eyes widening when he saw Timothy standing beside Cowman. I don't think it's wise for that boy to be walking around town. People are still upset about what his father did." "What if I told you that Blackjack Fletcher was set up?" Cowman asked. "What if I told you that someone in this town arranged for his wife and daughter to be sold into slavery, then sent him on a suicide mission to cover their tracks?" The editor's hands stilled on the metal type. That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof?" "I have an eyewitness," Cowman said, placing a protective hand on Timothy's shoulder. "This boy heard his father confessing the whole scheme the night before the robbery, but we need more evidence before we can publish anything." Finch glanced nervously toward the window, where several townspeople were going about their morning business. "Even if what you're saying is true, I can't print accusations against Mayor Blackwood without solid proof. He'd shut down my newspaper and run me out of town." "Then help us get that proof," Cowman urged. "You know this town better than anyone. You know who might be willing to talk, who might have seen something they shouldn't have." After a long moment, Finch nodded slowly. "There's a woman, Mrs. Catherine Mills. She runs the boarding house on Elm Street. She's been asking questions about Sarah Fletcher's disappearance, saying it doesn't make sense that a mother would abandon her children. And there's something else. She mentioned seeing some of Mayor Blackwood's men loading a wagon in the middle of the night about 2 weeks ago." Cowman felt his pulse quicken. "Would she be willing to talk to us?" "Maybe. She's got no love for the mayor. He's been trying to buy her property for months, making increasingly aggressive offers. But you'll need to be careful. If Blackwood finds out she's talking." They left the newspaper office with a plan. Finch would quietly reach out to Mrs. Mills and arrange a meeting, while Cowman and Timothy would gather what information they could from other sources. But as they walked down Main Street, Cowman noticed they were being watched. 3 men lounged outside the saloon, their eyes tracking every movement. Cowman recognized them as part of Mayor Blackwood's unofficial security force, men who handled the mayor's special projects when legal methods weren't sufficient. Their leader was a scarred gunfighter named Jake Morrison, the sheriff's younger brother who had a reputation for solving problems with violence. "We need to get out of here," Cowman murmured to Timothy. "Now!" But it was too late. Jake Morrison pushed himself away from the saloon wall and sauntered toward them, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Well, well," he drawled. "If it isn't the Good Samaritan himself. Heard you took in a stray dog, Cowman." "The boy's under my protection," Cowman replied evenly. "We don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Son, you invited trouble the moment you decided to play hero. See, some folks in town are worried about what stories this little bastard might be telling. Worried he might be spreading lies about decent people." Timothy pressed closer to Cowman's side, his small body trembling with fear. Cowman could feel the weight of his Colt against his hip, but he knew that drawing on Jake Morrison in the middle of Main Street would only make things worse. "If people are worried about lies," Cowman said carefully, "maybe they should be more concerned about the truth." Jake's eyes narrowed dangerously. "That sounds like a threat, rancher." "It's a promise," Cowman replied. "The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how deep you try to bury it." For a moment, the 2 men stared at each other, while the rest of Main Street seemed to hold its breath. Then Jake smiled, a cold, predatory expression that made Cowman's skin crawl. "You know what I think?" Jake said. "I think you and the boy should take a little ride out of town. Maybe visit some relatives in another territory. Might be healthier for everyone involved." "We're not going anywhere," Cowman said firmly. Jake's smile widened. "We'll see about that." As Morrison and his men walked away, Cowman realized that their investigation had just become exponentially more dangerous. Mayor Blackwood clearly knew that Timothy was talking, which meant they were running out of time. That afternoon, they met Mrs. Mills at her boarding house. She was a woman in her 50s, with steel gray hair and the kind of determined expression that suggested she had faced down plenty of bullies in her time. Her boarding house was clean and well-maintained, a refuge for travelers and workers who couldn't afford the fancier hotel downtown. "I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions," she said, serving them tea in her modest parlor. Sarah Fletcher was a good woman, despite what people said about her husband. "She used to bring me fresh eggs from their chickens, and we'd talk about our children. She would never have abandoned Timothy, not willingly." "What did you see that night?" Cowman asked. Mrs. Mills glanced toward the window, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "It was around midnight, maybe a little later. I couldn't sleep. My arthritis was acting up, so I was sitting by my window with some knitting. That's when I saw Mayor Blackwood's carriage pull up to the Fletcher house. 3 men got out, including that awful Jake Morrison. They went inside, and about an hour later they came out with Sarah and Emma." Timothy's breath caught in his throat. Were they hurt?" "They were unconscious," Mrs. Mills said gently. "Carried out like sacks of grain and loaded into a covered wagon. I wanted to do something, but what could I do? An old woman against armed men?" "Did you see which direction they went?" Cowman asked. "North, toward the Silver Creek Road." "But that's not all." Mrs. Mills leaned forward, lowering her voice. "The next morning, I saw Mayor Blackwood talking to Sheriff Morrison outside the bank. They were arguing about something, and I heard the mayor say, 'Make sure it looks like a real robbery attempt. We can't have any loose ends.'" The pieces of the conspiracy were falling into place, but Cowman knew they still needed more evidence. Testimony from Mrs. Mills and Timothy might not be enough to convince a judge, especially if that judge was in Mayor Blackwood's pocket. "There's something else you should know," Mrs. Mills continued. "I've heard rumors that the mayor has been involved in this kind of business before. Girls and women disappearing, always from families that owe him money or have crossed him somehow. There's a whole network of people involved. Buyers, transporters, guards. It's bigger than just what happened to the Fletcher family." As evening approached, Cowman and Timothy returned to the ranch to find an unwelcome surprise waiting for them. Mayor Blackwood himself sat on the front porch, flanked by Jake Morrison and two other gunmen. The mayor was a large man in his 60s, with silver hair and expensive clothes that couldn't quite hide the cruelty in his pale blue eyes. "Mr. Cowman," the mayor said pleasantly, as if he were paying a social call, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I felt it was time we had a conversation about your recent charitable activities." "Get off my land," Cowman said, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. Now, Blackwood chuckled. "There's no need for hostility. I'm here to make you an offer, a generous offer considering the circumstances." He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope. $5,000. More money than you'll see in 5 years of ranching. All you have to do is turn the boy over to me and forget whatever wild stories he's been telling you. Timothy whimpered and pressed against Cowman's side. The rancher could feel the boy's terror, and it only strengthened his resolve. "The boy stays with me," Cowman said firmly. Mayor Blackwood's pleasant expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "I was hoping you'd be reasonable. You see, Mr. Cowman, that boy is dangerous. He's been traumatized by his father's crimes, and he started believing in fantasies, delusions about conspiracies and kidnappings. It's really quite sad." "The only thing that's sad," Cowman replied, "is how far you'll go to cover up your crimes." The mayor stood slowly, his bulk casting a long shadow across the porch. "Crimes? That's a very serious accusation. I hope you have proof to back up such claims, because making false accusations against a public official is a crime itself." "We'll see who ends up in jail," Cowman said. Blackwood smiled, but it was the smile of a predator who had just decided to stop playing with his prey. "Indeed we will, but I should warn you, accidents happen out here in the desert, tragic accidents. Houses catch fire, people get lost in the wilderness. Sometimes they're never found." With that thinly veiled threat, the mayor and his men mounted their horses and rode away, leaving Cowman and Timothy alone in the gathering darkness. As they watched the riders disappear into the desert, Cowman realized that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. "Are we going to die?" Timothy asked quietly. Cowman put his arm around the boy's shoulders. "Not if I can help it, son. But we need to be smart about this, and we need help." That night, as Timothy slept fitfully in the spare room, Cowman sat at his kitchen table and wrote a detailed letter to Marshal Webb, outlining everything they had learned. He also wrote letters to newspaper editors in neighboring towns, hoping that if something happened to them, the truth would still come to light. But even as he planned their next moves, Cowman couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Mayor Blackwood was a powerful man with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. He had already destroyed one family to protect his secrets. He wouldn't hesitate to destroy another. The question was, could Cowman and Timothy expose the truth before Blackwood silenced them forever? As the wind howled across the desert, carrying with it the promise of a storm, Cowman checked his weapons one more time and settled in for what might be his last night of peace. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. Dawn brought no peace to Cowman's ranch. Timothy woke screaming from nightmares, and the morning air carried the acrid smell of smoke from the direction of town. As Cowman prepared breakfast, he noticed several riders on the distant hills, silhouettes that appeared and disappeared like vultures circling their prey. "They're watching us," Timothy whispered, peering through the kitchen window. "I know," Cowman replied, checking his rifle for the third time that morning. "But help is coming. My friend Marcus should arrive today, and then we'll have the law on our side." But as the hours passed with no sign of the federal marshal, Cowman began to worry. Marcus Webb was a reliable man who always kept his word. If he said he was coming, he would be there unless something had stopped him. Around noon, their fears were confirmed when Harold Finch arrived at the ranch, his face pale with terror. "They got him!" he gasped, stumbling from his horse. "They got your marshal friend." Cowman's blood turned to ice. "What happened?" "His stagecoach was attacked about 10 miles outside of town," Finch explained, accepting a cup of water with shaking hands. Bandits, they're calling it. But everyone knows it was Morrison and his men. The marshal is alive, but he's badly wounded and being held at Doc Peterson's clinic. Mayor Blackwood has posted guards there, claiming it's for the marshal's protection. The trap was closing around them. With Marshal Webb neutralized, they had lost their most powerful ally. But Cowman wasn't ready to give up. If anything, the attack on a federal officer had only strengthened his resolve. "There's more," Finch continued. "Mrs. Mills is missing. Her boarding house was ransacked last night, and nobody's seen her since. And the mayor has put out word that you and the boy are wanted for questioning in connection with the marshal's attack." Timothy's face went white. "They're going to blame us for everything, aren't they?" "Not if we move fast," Cowman said grimly. "Finch, I need you to get word to every honest person in this town. Tell them to meet us at the old mining camp north of Silver Creek tonight. It's time to stop hiding and start fighting back." "That's suicide," Finch protested. "Silver Creek is Blackwood's territory. He owns half the businesses there, and the other half are too scared to cross him." "Maybe," Cowman replied, "but it's also where Sarah and Emma Fletcher are being held, and I made a promise to this boy that I intend to keep." As afternoon faded into evening, Cowman and Timothy prepared for what might be their final mission. They loaded their horses with supplies and weapons, including a stick of dynamite that Cowman had been saving for clearing stumps. If they were going to rescue the Fletcher women, they would need every advantage they could get. The ride to Silver Creek took them through treacherous mountain passes and across desert valleys where the shadows played tricks on the eyes. Timothy rode beside Cowman in silence, his young face set with determination that reminded the rancher of his own father's stubborn courage. Silver Creek was a boomtown built around a series of silver mines that had made fortunes for men like Mayor Blackwood. The main street was lined with saloons, gambling halls, and brothels, all designed to separate miners from their hard-earned wages. It was exactly the kind of place where women could disappear without anyone asking uncomfortable questions. They approached the town from the east, using an old mining trail that Cowman remembered from his younger days. The plan was simple. Locate Sarah and Emma Fletcher, create enough chaos to cover their escape, and get out before Blackwood's men could organize a pursuit. But as they crested the final ridge overlooking Silver Creek, they discovered they weren't alone. A small group of riders waited in the shadows of an abandoned mine shaft. Harold Finch, Mrs. Catherine Mills, and, surprisingly, Sheriff Morrison himself. "Don't shoot," the sheriff called out as Cowman reached for his rifle. "We're here to help." "Help?" Cowman replied suspiciously. "Last I heard, you were working for the mayor." Sheriff Morrison removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. "I've been working for the law, or trying to. But when my own brother started threatening federal marshals, I realized I'd been blind to what was really happening in this town." Mrs. Mills stepped forward, her face bearing the bruises of a recent beating. "They tried to silence me, but Harold here helped me escape, and the sheriff has been asking his own questions about his brother's activities. I found records," Morrison explained, pulling a leather satchel from his saddlebags. "Bank transfers, property deeds, correspondence between my brother and some very unsavory characters. Mayor Blackwood has been running a human trafficking operation for years, using his political position to cover his tracks." Finch nodded eagerly. "We also found out where they're keeping the Fletcher women. There's a house on the outskirts of town. Looks like a respectable boarding house, but it's really a prison. Armed guards, barred windows, the works." Timothy's eyes filled with tears of hope and fear. Are they okay?" "They're alive," Mrs. Mills said gently. "That's all we know for certain. But we need to move quickly. Word is that Blackwood plans to move them again tomorrow night, to buyers in California." The rescue plan was dangerous but straightforward. Sheriff Morrison would create a distraction by arresting some of Blackwood's men on trumped-up charges, drawing attention away from the boarding house. Meanwhile, Cowman and Timothy would approach from the rear, using Cowman's dynamite to blow a hole in the back wall. Mrs. Mills and Finch would wait with fresh horses for the escape. As they prepared to move, Timothy grabbed Cowman's arm. "What if we're too late? What if they've already been hurt too bad to save?" Cowman knelt down to the boy's level, looking him straight in the eyes. "Son, sometimes the only choice we have is between doing nothing and doing something. Even if the odds are against us, even if we might fail, we have to try. That's what separates good people from cowards." The boarding house sat on a hill overlooking Silver Creek's main street, surrounded by a high wooden fence topped with barbed wire. Lights burned in several windows, and armed guards patrolled the perimeter. It looked more like a fortress than a place of business. Cowman and Timothy approached through a dry creek bed that ran behind the property. The rancher had wrapped the dynamite in cloth to muffle any sound, and he carried a long fuse that would give them time to get clear before the explosion. As they crept closer to the building, they could hear voices from inside. Men laughing and drinking, the sound of cards being shuffled, and underneath it all, the faint sound of women crying. Timothy's hands clenched into fists at the sound. "That's my ma," he whispered. "I know her voice." Cowman placed the dynamite against the rear wall of the building, in a spot that looked like it might be near the women's quarters. He lit the fuse and grabbed Timothy's hand. "Run!" They sprinted back toward the creek bed as the fuse burned down. Behind them, shouts erupted from the building as the guards noticed the flickering light. But it was too late. The explosion shattered the night, blowing a hole in the wall large enough for a man to walk through. Immediately, chaos erupted throughout the compound. Guards ran toward the blast site, shouting orders and firing their weapons into the darkness. Cowman and Timothy rushed through the smoking hole into what appeared to be a storage room. Beyond that, they could hear women screaming and men shouting. Following the sound of familiar voices, they found a narrow hallway lined with locked doors. "Ma!" Timothy called out. "Ma, it's me. Timothy?" The voice that answered was weak but unmistakably Sarah Fletcher's. "Timothy, is that really you?" They found her in the third room they checked, chained to a bed alongside her daughter Emma. Both women were thin and bruised but alive. Sarah Fletcher was in her 30s with the same dark hair as her son, while Emma was perhaps 8 years old, with wide eyes that had seen too much. "We're getting you out of here," Cowman said, using his rifle butt to break the chains that held them. "Can you walk?" "I think so," Sarah replied, struggling to her feet. "But Emma's been sick. I don't know if she can run." "Then I'll carry her," Timothy said, scooping up his little sister despite his own small size. "We're going home, Emma. We're all going home." But as they made their way back toward the hole in the wall, they found their escape route blocked. Jake Morrison stood in the smoking doorway, his gun drawn and his face twisted with rage. "Well, well," he snarled. "The hero and his little rescue party. You've caused me a lot of trouble, rancher." "Let them go, Morrison," Cowman said, his own weapon trained on the gunfighter. "Your quarrel is with me." "My quarrel is with anyone who threatens my business," Morrison replied. "You see, these women are valuable property. And property doesn't get to walk away just because some bleeding heart decides to play savior. They're human beings," Cowman said firmly. "Not property." Morrison laughed coldly. "Human beings, property. What's the difference? In this world, everything has a price, and everyone can be bought or sold." The standoff stretched for several tense seconds. Behind Morrison, more guards were approaching, drawn by the sound of voices. Cowman realized that even if he could outdraw Morrison, there were too many enemies to fight. But then salvation came from an unexpected source. Sheriff Morrison appeared behind his brother, his own gun drawn. "Drop your weapon, Jake. It's over." "Brother?" Jake Morrison's voice was filled with disbelief. "You're choosing them over family?" "I'm choosing right over wrong," the sheriff replied sadly. "Something I should have done a long time ago." For a moment, it looked like Jake might surrender, but then his face hardened with desperate fury, and he spun toward his brother, gun blazing. The sheriff fired back, and both men fell to the ground in a tangle of blood and gun smoke. "Go!" Sheriff Morrison gasped, clutching a wound in his shoulder. "Get them out of here before more guards arrive!" They ran through the night, carrying Emma between them while Sarah Fletcher stumbled along on legs weakened by weeks of captivity. Behind them, Silver Creek erupted in chaos as word spread of the rescue and the shooting. But Mrs. Mills and Finch were waiting with horses just as promised. As they rode hard toward the safety of the desert, Timothy looked back at the burning lights of Silver Creek. "Is it really over?" he asked. "Not yet," Cowman replied. "We still have to make sure Mayor Blackwood pays for what he's done. But the hardest part is behind us now. Your family is safe." Sarah Fletcher, riding double with her daughter, reached out to touch Cowman's arm. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You risked everything for people you barely knew." "Sometimes," Cowman replied, thinking of his own parents and the values they had taught him. "Doing the right thing is its own reward." As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the little group of survivors made their way toward an uncertain but hopeful future. They had struck a blow against corruption and cruelty, but the final battle still lay ahead. Mayor Blackwood was still free, still powerful, and undoubtedly planning his revenge. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Cowman felt like they had a real chance of winning. They had the evidence, they had witnesses, and most importantly, they had each other. The storm had broken, but the sun was beginning to shine through the clouds. 3 days after the rescue at Silver Creek, Dustwood Valley buzzed with rumors and whispers. Mayor Blackwood had declared martial law, claiming that dangerous criminals were threatening the peace of the community. Armed men patrolled the streets, and anyone caught spreading seditious lies faced immediate arrest. But in a hidden canyon 20 miles from town, a different kind of gathering was taking place. Word had spread through the territory about the corruption in Dustwood, and people were coming from far and wide to hear the truth. Federal marshals, territorial judges, newspaper reporters, and honest citizens from a dozen communities had assembled to witness what would become known as the Desert Tribunal. Cowman stood before the crowd, holding Timothy's hand while Sarah and Emma Fletcher sat nearby, still recovering from their ordeal, but determined to see justice done. The evidence they had gathered was spread across makeshift tables. Bank records, correspondence, witness statements, and Sheriff Morrison's detailed confession about his brother's crimes. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Judge Harrison Wells, a federal judge who had traveled from the territorial capital, "we are here today to examine evidence of corruption, human trafficking, and conspiracy that reaches to the highest levels of local government." The proceedings began with Timothy's testimony. The boy stood straight and tall, his voice clear and strong as he recounted the night his father had confessed the truth about Mayor Blackwood's scheme. There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd as he described finding his father's grave and the days of hunger and fear that followed. Sarah Fletcher's testimony was even more damning. She described in detail how Mayor Blackwood's men had come to her home in the middle of the night, how she and Emma had been drugged and transported to Silver Creek, and the horrors they had endured in captivity. "He told me it was business," she said, her voice shaking with controlled anger. "That my husband owed him money, and this was how the debt would be paid. He said I should be grateful that he was giving me and my daughter useful work, instead of just killing us." Mrs. Mills testified about what she had witnessed the night of the kidnapping, and Harold Finch presented the financial records that showed suspicious money transfers between Mayor Blackwood's accounts and known criminal organizations. But the most explosive testimony came from an unexpected source. Dr. Peterson, the town physician who had been treating Marshall Webb, stood before the crowd with a grim expression. "I can no longer remain silent," he declared. "For years I have treated women and girls who were brought to me by Mayor Blackwood's men. They told me these were prostitutes who needed medical attention, and I believed them. But I realize now that many of these women were victims, not willing participants. I have records of at least 30 cases over the past 5 years. The crowd murmured in shock and anger. 30 women and girls. It was a scale of criminality that none of them had imagined. As the evidence mounted, it became clear that Mayor Blackwood's operation was far more extensive than anyone had realized. He had been using his political position to identify vulnerable families, then arranging for their female members to be kidnapped and sold into prostitution. The profits were laundered through his various business interests, and anyone who threatened to expose the scheme was eliminated. But Mayor Blackwood wasn't finished fighting. As the tribunal continued, lookouts, reported a large group of armed riders approaching the canyon. The mayor had gathered every gunfighter and criminal he could hire, determined to silence the witnesses before they could complete their testimony. "He's coming with at least 50 men," reported one of the scouts. "They'll be here within the hour." Judge Wells looked around at the assembled crowd, mostly honest citizens with little experience in gunfights. "We need to evacuate immediately. We can continue these proceedings in the territorial capital where we'll have proper protection." But Cowman stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "With respect, Your Honor, if we run now, Blackwood wins. He'll claim we were all criminals and conspirators, and he'll use his political connections to bury this evidence. This ends here, today." Marshal Webb, still weak from his injuries but determined to see justice done, struggled to his feet. "The rancher's right. We have the law on our side, and we have the truth. It's time to make a stand." What followed was unlike any battle in the history of the American West. It wasn't a clash between outlaws and lawmen, but between corruption and justice, between those who would exploit the innocent and those who would protect them. The defenders took positions among the rocks and scrub brush of the canyon, while the women and children were moved to safety in a cave system at the rear. Cowman found himself fighting alongside federal marshals, honest sheriffs from neighboring counties, and ordinary citizens who had decided they'd had enough of Mayor Blackwood's tyranny. The battle began at sunset, with Blackwood's hired guns charging into the canyon with guns blazing. But they had underestimated their opponents. These weren't helpless victims. They were people fighting for their homes, their families, and their future. Cowman found himself face to face with Mayor Blackwood, himself, who had come to personally oversee the destruction of the evidence against him. The mayor was armed with an expensive rifle and flanked by 2 bodyguards, but his face showed the desperation of a man who knew his empire was crumbling. "You should have taken my offer," Blackwood snarled, firing a shot that barely missed Cowman's head. $5,000 and a chance to walk away. Now you'll die with the rest of these fools." "The only fool here is you," Cowman replied, taking careful aim with his own rifle. "You thought you could buy and sell human beings like cattle. You thought you could terrorize an entire community into silence, but you forgot something important." "What's that?" Blackwood demanded. "Sometimes people fight back." The final confrontation was brief but decisive. Blackwood's hired guns, faced with determined resistance and the knowledge that they were fighting for a lost cause, began to surrender or flee. The mayor himself, seeing his empire collapse around him, made one last desperate attempt to escape. But Timothy Fletcher, the boy who had started this whole chain of events by telling the truth about his father's death, stepped into Blackwood's path. The mayor raised his gun, but before he could fire, Cowman's rifle spoke with final authority. Mayor Blackwood fell to the desert floor. His reign of terror ended forever. As the smoke cleared and the last of the hired guns surrendered, Judge Wells emerged from cover to survey the scene. "By the authority vested in me by the territorial government," he declared, "I hereby order the immediate seizure of all property and assets belonging to the Blackwood criminal organization. These assets will be used to compensate the victims and to establish a fund for the protection of vulnerable families throughout the territory." The trials that followed made headlines across the nation. The Dustwood Conspiracy, as the newspapers called it, became a symbol of how ordinary citizens could stand up to corruption and win. Dozens of Blackwood's associates were arrested and convicted, and the human trafficking network was completely dismantled. But for Cowman, the real victory was much more personal. 6 months after the battle in the canyon, he stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching Timothy and Emma play in the yard while Sarah Fletcher prepared dinner in the kitchen. The federal government had granted him legal guardianship of the Fletcher family, and they had become the family he had never thought he would have. Timothy had grown taller and stronger, his hollow cheeks filled out with regular meals, and his eyes bright with hope for the future. Emma had recovered from her trauma with the resilience of childhood, though she still sometimes woke from nightmares. And Sarah had proven to be not just a survivor, but a strong and capable woman who brought warmth and laughter to the lonely ranch house. "Pa Cowman," Timothy called out, using the name he had started calling his guardian. Emma wants to know if we can visit the cemetery tomorrow. She wants to put flowers on our real pa's grave." Cowman smiled, remembering the night he had found Timothy in that same cemetery, alone and afraid. "Of course we can, son. It's important to remember where we came from, even as we build something new." As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Cowman reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He had been a lonely rancher, content with his solitary existence and his simple routines. But sometimes, fate had other plans. The town of Dustwood had been transformed as well. With Mayor Blackwood's corruption exposed and his criminal network destroyed, honest people had stepped forward to take leadership roles. Harold Finch had been elected as the new mayor, running on a platform of transparency and justice. Mrs. Mills had opened a school for children whose families had been affected by the trafficking network, and Sheriff Morrison, recovered from his wounds, had been appointed as the territorial marshal for the region. But perhaps the most important change was in the people themselves. They had learned that silence in the face of evil was not safety. It was complicity. They had discovered that ordinary citizens, when they stood together for what was right, could overcome even the most powerful corruption. As the family gathered around the dinner table that evening, Sarah Fletcher raised her glass of water in a toast. "To second chances," she said, her eyes bright with tears of gratitude. "And to the man who gave them to us." "To family," Cowman replied, looking around at the faces of the people who had become his whole world. "And to the truth that sets us free." Timothy, now almost 13 and wise beyond his years, added his own toast. "To Pa Cowman, who taught us that heroes aren't born. They're made by the choices they make when nobody's watching." Outside, the desert wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings. The graveyard where this story began still stood on the hill overlooking Dustwood, but it was no longer a place of secrets and sorrow. It had become a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope could take root and grow. And in the years that followed, when travelers passed through Dustwood Valley and heard the story of the lonely rancher who had saved a family and brought down a corrupt empire, they would shake their heads in wonder. Some would say it was too incredible to be true, that such things only happened in dime novels and tall tales. But the people of Dustwood knew better. They knew that sometimes, when the stakes are high enough and the cause is just enough, ordinary people can do extraordinary things. They knew that courage is contagious, and that standing up for what's right, even when it's dangerous, even when it's difficult, is what separates civilization from chaos. The graveyard had given up its secret, and in doing so, it had given birth to something beautiful, a family forged not by blood, but by choice, a community united not by fear, but by hope, and a legacy that would inspire generations to come. As Timothy Fletcher, now Timothy Cowman, would tell his own children years later, "Sometimes the best families are the ones we choose for ourselves, and sometimes the greatest adventures begin in the most unlikely places, even in a graveyard, on a night when a lonely man decides to do the right thing." Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.